The word resilience implies the ability to bounce back after adversity, a challenge, a stressful situation, an illness. And in its like most basic meaning, it implies the capacity for survival and a sense of being able to endure and come out the other end intact. I think most people know what resilience is, but I think culturally we've generally misunderstood how we go about becoming more resilient. We conflate, fostering resilience with pushing through against adversity. And, we hear it in expressions such as, keep a stiff upper lip, which originally I thought that was a British expression, but it's actually an American expression that not only points to this ability to stay resolute, but it also implied that in staying resolute, we never give way to our emotions. Here in New Zealand, people often use the expression when they perceive someone to be weak, suck it up or harden up. And curiously, we have one of the highest teenage suicide rates in the world. And what we're learning about that is that just hardening up, just shutting our emotions away or becoming more and more brittle in response to stress is not ultimately the way that we build resilience. So, while there's a certain truth to facing difficult situations with detachment and perseverance, what we might call character building experiences, I think culturally we have this fundamental misunderstanding about how we go about fostering healthy resilience. So in looking at the how of it, I wanted to tell a little story of my first years on the farm, because I've learned the most about resilience from nature and from observing nature. I bought this land over 20 years ago, and it is in a very harsh position. It's we get long droughts here, summers where we have very little water, we have strong winds, and we can have very cold winters. And I desperately wanted to have oak trees on the property and along the drive. And so I did a little bit of research about the kind of species that might survive here. And I was told that there was one oak in particular, it's an Algerian oak, that would be likely to survive these very harsh conditions. And I was given this piece of advice by the person who knew about Algerian oaks. He said, don't make the mistake after a few years of thinking that they've died and ripping them out, because what will be happening over those first few years is the oak will be putting its taproot down. And it will look as if it's not increasing its girth in its trunk, and it'll look as if it's not growing upward and outwards. But what the oak is doing is it's putting this taproot down. Now we have really heavy clay soils here in Sefton at the base of Mount Grey. So I was advised to get machinery in here to rip through the clay pan, which I did. So we cut through this very, very dense clay pan. And sure enough, these Algerian oaks, they appeared to be doing nothing for about 4 years. And I felt quite disheartened. I thought, I'm never going to have mature trees on the property. And then suddenly, after about 4 years, the trunks started increasing in width. And as soon as those taproots were really anchored in the substratum of the soil, they began to shoot up. And now we have this beautiful canopy on the driveway down to the house, a whole line of about 30 or 40 Algerian oaks. What I take from that is that resilience really comes because these trees have survived 190K windstorms. They have survived summers of drought with no water. They've survived snowstorms and really extreme conditions here. Is that nature needs this consistency to really find a deep and reliable source of nourishment. And the trees that have done very, very well on the property are those that position themselves, if you can talk about a tree having that kind of consciousness, but there's one particular tree, the largest tree on the property, and it is right near a stream. And that area of the land is always moist, even in the middle of a drought. That tree is always getting this moisture. I came away from this reflection on what I'd learned about the oaks, asking myself, how can I position myself so that I can access deep reserves and resources to nourish myself to be able to thrive? And through that vitality, build a sustainable resilience. And I came up with several things that I thought were really, really important in terms of building this connection, this deep taproot, to always be able to rely on this deeper source of nourishment. And there are 5 things. The first is sufficient rest. The second is sufficient relaxation. And the third is sufficient positive stress. The fourth, sufficient joy. And the fifth was sufficient hope. And I wanted to unpack each of these a little bit. Because again, just as we conflate resilience with pushing through, we often conflate these other aspects of how we go about getting resilience as well. Sufficient rest. Culturally, we have a resistance to rest. We interpret it often as weakness. And as a culture, we have this very perverse relationship to fatigue. I was listening to an interview recently with a science journalist, Christy Ashwandon, who wrote a book called Good to Go, what the athlete in all of us can learn from the strange science of recovery. And she looked at this plethora of purported claims about sports recovery drinks and infrared pajamas and cryotherapy and all kinds of ways that athletes can go about building their recovery from exercise. And there's $1 billion industry that goes with that. And she found that almost all of these approaches to recovery essentially had no scientific backing or basis or proof. But there was one thing that did make the most difference, and that was rest. If an athlete could get sufficient deep sleep, that made the most tangible, measurable difference to their recovery, their ability to put themselves through a very intense, say, bicycle ride or an intense workout and be able to bounce back. And interestingly, she found many athletes felt guilty about resting, which I think is another form of this cultural expression in relationship to normal fatigue. She found that companies that were trying to measure recovery through blood tests and fit watches and so on, that we're always looking for this very quantifiable measurement in terms of our physiology. But she discovered that the very best measurement was really the subjective sense of how do I feel? How do I feel? Do I feel rested? Do I feel tired? Do I feel sore? Do I feel ebullient and my capable capable of once again bouncing back? And the other thing that she discovered that I thought could be really useful for people is that when athletes believe that something works, quote unquote, including simple things like ice bath, they actually do work because they make the person feel better. So essentially, recovery is a feeling. It's the sense that your brain is taking all these inputs in, and what you come away with is, I feel good, I feel better, I feel rested. So, sufficient rest is really the one side of the coin that allows us, when we have that deep nourishment that comes from deep sleep, to be able to then wake up and have the energy to meet the day. And we don't usually think of rest and resilience in the same sentence. We think of resilience as work, rather than it requiring this deep resource. And, following on that, sufficient relaxation is so important, because as a culture, we have this really distorted relationship to relaxation, where we interpret relaxation as collapse. So when we have our parasympathetic nervous system as an energetic anchor for the body, blood flow is being directed to our digestive system. Blood flow is being directed to our respiratory organs. And we're engaged in what Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen calls rest, recuperation, and regeneration. Parasympathetic nervous system is there as that anchor. And she calls them the 3 R's. I love that: rest, recuperation, and regeneration. But in order for our whole system to be really balanced, we also need sufficient positive stress. And I really want to unpack this, because generally when we hear the word stress and we think of the sympathetic nervous system, we immediately think of the most extreme expression of stress, which is when the nervous system is overwhelmed, and we describe this as the stress response to fight, to take flight, or to freeze. But what Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen had to say about this in her recent book, Basic Neurocellular Patterns, I found very, very helpful. She says that those 3 F's, fight, flight, or freeze, these are times when we're actually overloaded with stimulation or under imminent threat of danger. And, I meet a lot of people who describe their primary experience as being overwhelmed. And that's not the soil for building resilience, being in this hyper vigilant state of a sympathetic nervous system. But what the beautiful thing that Bonnie had to say about this that I found so useful is that she says there's a more moderate response in our sympathetic nervous system where blood is still being directed to the skeletal muscles, but we're engaged in what she calls the 3 A's: alertness, attentiveness, and action. And that more moderate response of the sympathetic nervous system means we're truly learning how to be at ease with an effort. We're learning how to simultaneously be focused outwards and engaged in the world, but grounded inwardly, attentive but relaxed. And it really has been one of my key learnings over the last 20 years of international touring. Sometimes I'm in a different country every week. I have one rest day. I'm changing climates. I'm changing cultures. I'm sometimes changing languages. I'm in unfamiliar environments after my sleep is disturbed. And the thing that's allowed me to stay healthy for most of these tours is to learn how to be at ease within the effort, how to have that base support of the parasympathetic nervous system, and to be outwardly engaged and attentive, but not everything going out, the sympathetic nervous system in this highly vigilant state, which we know is not sustainable. And the last two, which kind of brings us back, I think, to the questions that we're going to explore later in the interview, is to have sufficient joy and sufficient hope in our lives as well. Because when we think of resilience, what are we bouncing back for? If we don't have a purpose and a vision to our lives, if we don't have something that we really believe in and want to live for, then there isn't a reason for engaging in the world. And I don't think that hope is implicit to the human condition. When we don't have enough hope in our future, we don't have a clear reason to persevere. When we don't have a vision of something that we want to commit to, we don't have a reason to build and to cultivate stickability and tenaciousness and a work ethic that goes with it. So hope is something that needs to be generated, and that can be regenerated through community. It can be regenerated through a commitment to a vision. But the key thing, I think, in having sufficient joy and sufficient hope is choosing something, because we can't do everything, but choosing something that we can commit to that builds a sustained sense of meaning in our lives. And I love the saying that Dr. Martin Luther King said so many years ago. He said, "Even if I knew tomorrow that the world would go to pieces, I would still plant an apple tree today." And we're kind of in that world right now where it feels very bleak with climate change, with the pandemic, with everything that's going on, especially for our young people. And it's that sense of hope for the future that we can say, I'm still going to plant a tree today.